In this second chapter of our textbook, we're going to be exploring some of the fundamental aspects of communication. In this chapter, we'll develop a definition of communication, we'll explore the elements of the communication model, we'll look at the relationship between culture and communication, and some of the characteristics of communication. Finally, we'll examine the functions of culture in our society. What is communication? What are the components of communication? And what's the relationship between communication and culture? These are all really important questions to ask. In this course, we'll define communication as a symbolic process by which meaning is shared and negotiated. It's the basis of all human contact. As to the process of communication, we share ideas and feelings. Essentially, to communicate is to be human. So how does communication actually take place? Isn't it really simple? We would assume it's, for instance, if you're having a conversation with someone, the communication is one person speaking while the other person listens and then the other person speaks. Communication is actually quite the complex process, and while it involves language or verbal communication, we'll discover that most of the communication or most of the meaning in our messages takes place at a nonverbal level. So that's everything but the spoken word. But how does the process take place? Social scientists in the 1920s started studying this process. And what came out of their research what were some early models or theories. A model is just a visual representation of a theory. And one of the early models that came out was called the hypodermic needle or the bullet theory. And this model and theory attempted to explain how the communication process works. So these early models were also unidirectional, meaning that the communication was perceived to flow only in one direction, as you can see from the sender to the receiver. And it also tended to have a lot of other issues, this early model, in that it did not seem to fully grasp the complex nature of communication. For instance, it's assuming that the information from the sender is the information that the receiver receives. It also assumes that the receiver doesn't have any information to send back, which we call in the language of the discipline feedback. It also assumes that there's nothing blocking or interfering this message from being received, and we call that noise. So that early model lasted until the 1970s. And you can see from the early model, it was also assumed that the effect of the message was pretty immediate and that the receiver didn't have any opportunity to fend off that message, the potency of that message. So that's why they call it the hypodermic needle or bullet theory. But later models developed, and they essentially included this process that we call feedback, recognizing that this information does not flow in one direction. Some of the theories from these models include what are called the uses and gratifications theory that was developed by McQuail, Blumler, and Brown. Also the two-step flow theory from Katz and Lazarsfeld, and a limited effects model. A lot of these theories were focused primarily on the impact of mass media such as children's television programming and its effects on children's behavior. We recognize now that communication is a lot more complex from these earlier two models by examining what we call the transactional model of communication. And you can see in this is a lot more complex than the first two models that we saw. So we understand that there are some basic components that make up the communication process. And the components include what we call the source of the message. That's the originator of the message, so it can be the sender. And you can see in this case the source is represented as a human being. That's the person who has originated or created the message. And then the receiver is the intended or unintended recipient of the message. In this case, the receivers are characterized as an audience of individuals listening to the source, the sender. And then we have the message itself. That's the content that's being shared. This includes, again, intended and unintended communication. It's verbal or nonverbal in its elements. And we have the channel. The channel is the mode by which this message is being communicated. Is it an electronic channel, such as television, or is it computer mediated, such as a text message or a Snapchat message? Is the message being communicated face to face? Okay, these are all channels. And the channel is important because it can impact the quality as well as the clarity of the communication. And you're going to learn that all cultures do not necessarily, for instance, share the same nonverbal symbols. So if we're communicating face to face and we're having a communication exchange in the context of intercultural communication exchange, and I frown or I give a puzzled look, it doesn't necessarily translate to the same nonverbal meaning in another culture. We also talk about this process of encoding and decoding. Encoding happens on the source's end, on the sender's end, and it's the process of carefully crafting a message in a form that will hopefully be communicated. And decoding is the process of making meaning of that message. It happens on the receiver's end. It's when the receiver essentially tries to interpret the message of the sender. Also recognize in this transactional model something called frame of reference or field of experience. And that's the little frames around everyone's head. Basically what a frame of reference is recognizing that we all have individual respective worldviews. These are made up of our backgrounds, our experiences in life, our family upbringing, our culture, our religion, our languages spoken. And frame of reference is important. I mentioned this in chapter 1. It's almost like having tinted colored eyeglasses, right? And it helps us to interpret our reality. Well, that's what frame of reference is. We all have uniquely different frames of reference based on our experiences, and it's through these experiences that frame how we interact with other people, especially in the context of an intercultural exchange. We also recognize noise. Noise is defined as anything that stops the intended message from being received or it alters it. So noise can be a physical noise, such as a car driving by with a siren, like a police car with a siren as you're having a communication exchange. That's physical noise. You can hear it, and it's distracting, right? It's altering or stopping the intended message from being received. Noise can also be internal. Maybe you're hungry or you have a headache or you're tired, where you're not necessarily paying as much attention if you were at your best, your optimal physical level of performance. Well, that's noise also. Noise can also be semantic, and that means it has to do with language and how language is produced. So maybe you're speaking with someone and you perceive they have an accent, right? It's always the other person with an accent. Well, that's considered noise because it could block or alter the intended message from being received. And we recognize also feedback. So for every response you receive from a person you're communicating with, they're going to give you another response. It can be verbal or it can be nonverbal. So, for instance, in North American culture, we nod our heads and smile when someone is speaking to us because we're recognizing or acknowledging we hear them and we agree with what they're saying. What then is the relationship between communication and culture? It's been argued that communication equals culture and culture equals communication. This expression recognizes the complex, interdependent, and reciprocal relationship between these two concepts. It also suggests that culture influences communication, and communication in turn influences culture. As we'll see throughout this course, this is probably most evident in cultural values. For example, I'm a native of New Orleans, and one of my cultural identities is that of Southern culture. In this culture, it's common or even expected for one to be kind to strangers and greet them with a hello when you're in public spaces. In my hometown, it's even common to be invited out for a meal by someone you meet briefly. This is just part of the culture. In turn, this communication style translates into a cultural value of being kind and hospitable, and this value is communicated with open communication to others. Communication is also vital in helping us shape our perception of the world around us. We use communication to learn about another person. It helps us to describe ourselves to others, and it helps us to meet basic interpersonal needs through its interactional nature. From communicating with others, we satisfy a basic social need. So, a couple of characteristics of communication we want to keep in mind. The first is that it's dynamic. That means it's not static, it's always changing. We're not the same people we were a day ago, a week ago, a year ago. We're not going to be the same person we are today, 5 years from now, 5 days from now. So, that's recognizing that this whole process is dynamic, it's constantly changing. It's also symbolic. We assign meaning to symbols. The symbols themselves have no power, but the power that we give it as a society. And then we make inferences from the symbols we produce. So, for instance, if you saw the symbol of a Mercedes Benz decal on the front of a car, you would make certain assumptions about the car and its owner, right? Because of the inferences we make about that one symbol. Finally, communication is also contextual, and that basically means it's part of a larger system, right? And this includes location, occasion, time, and even the number of participants. Another characteristic of communication that's important to keep in mind is that it is verbal as well as non-verbal. And these codes are learned behavior. We learn about how to say hello in our culture, right? When we're growing up, it doesn't come naturally. We're not born and just know that it's culturally acceptable in North America to shake a hand with a stranger. We wouldn't walk up to a total stranger and kiss them, right? Because we've never learned that either through observation or through training. So it's everything that we do, we learn that this is acceptable. So, for instance, in Northern Europe, many countries in Northern Europe, or Western Europe rather, it's very acceptable for men to greet each other with a kiss on both sides of the cheek, right? And that is learned behavior. But in the West, we would interpret that differently because we just have different learned behaviors about acceptable greetings based on our cultural values. It has also a consequence. Messages do something to someone else. We can change people when we exchange messages with them, right? So we change people, and people can change us with the messages that they send to us. So that means we need to think about our both our verbal as well as our nonverbal choice of symbols that we use when we engage with other people, particularly in an intercultural communication context. And we'll get into that some more when we talk about verbal and nonverbal communication. One of the functions of culture is to teach people how to adapt to their surroundings. Culture is really important, and this happens early on in our socialization process. When we're brought from home from the hospital, we start learning instantly this information from how others even respond to us when we cry. In addition to teaching us how to adapt to our surroundings, culture functions to pass along previous knowledge and experiences to future generations. In so doing, it perpetuates a culture. So, again, we talk about these important characteristics of culture. One important characteristic is that of its origin. Where do we get our culture from? Is it passed down at birth in our DNA? No, of course not. We learn culture. We learn it both formally and informally. Informally, we learn it, what it means to be a member of our culture through observation. That happens mostly through family dynamics and through other interpersonal relationships. Formally, we learn our culture through formal teaching conducted through social institutions. This includes our church, our school, etc. Culture is also taught through proverbs and in art. These are saying that most cultures share and are passed down through generations to teach values implicit in that culture. So in the West, for instance, we have so many proverbs related to time because time is heavily valued in Western culture. We say time flies, time is money, don't waste my time, right? That's teaching members of our culture that time is important, and so we should value time. This is not the case in many cultures, and it's not that time is not important. It's not as core a value as it is in Western culture. And we know, again, time is important because we have timepieces embedded into a lot of our furniture. In most public spaces, even in classrooms at the college, there are clocks in every classroom. Again, it's a constant reminder. We have clocks in our dishwashers, we have clocks in our coffee pots, we have clocks on clothing. We have clocks on our watches, of course, our watch is a timepiece, but we also have clocks in our phones, we have clocks on our cars. Again, this is a visual reminder, not without saying it explicitly. Time is really important because we relate time to money. We also learn a lot about culture through the mass media, television, radio, newspaper, and of course, social media sites. What type of images are commonly used to communicate a message? What types of word choices are used? These choices often reflect the values that are important to a culture. I often will look through print magazines, and when I teach this course in a face to face setting, I bring in print magazines and I have students look at just the advertisements, and it's really interesting. And I would encourage y'all to do this if you have access to newspapers or print magazines, but look at American ads because they're telling you often what we value as a culture based on what images you see, right? And what images you don't see. To keep a culture going, when we talk about cultures being perpetuated, passing from one generation to another, the traditions and beliefs of that culture must be shared within that culture to maintain the culture's future. And that includes verbal as well as nonverbal. Culture is also dynamic, right? So they're subject to change. Changes can be brought on by new technology, for instance. I am in my 50s and I can't ever imagine or I can't ever remember people being so distracted by one piece of technology before ever in my lifetime, and that's the phone, right? So regardless of what kind of phone you have, if you go into a public space, most people are staring at this little box that you're holding in your hands, which to me is a major cultural change. Now we have all these words to describe our relationship with our phones. It's just it's amazing. But yeah, so our culture has changed, and we shouldn't assume that every culture has the same issues. Our issue right now tends to be our significant attraction to our technology, and that's not the case in many other cultures. Changes today are much more prolific, right? These are promoted by many different things, including the rise of American capitalism. It's also promoted by worldwide population growth. It's promoted by large movement of immigrants, and it's promoted by the proliferation of information technology, which I just spoke of. And we'll get into these issues some more and throughout this course. Culture is also deeply rooted in tradition, and inherently it seeks to sustain and endure itself and its customs over time. And this happens through what we call institutional deep structures. These are structures within a culture that really try to resist major alterations, such as the family, the church and state, or the government. Popular culture may be open to change, and we have seen major changes impacting deep structure institutions in the United States. For instance, same sex marriages, right? And the church. Many churches have even altered their basic beliefs, their tenets, to attract and retain members. I know that the Pew Research puts out a report every year on Americans' religiosity and Americans' beliefs in structured, organized religion. And every year, for the past few years, according to Pew Research, Americans are increasingly not identifying with any type of specific religion, but they're saying that they are religious or they believe in a higher being. That's a major shift from 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So, for the most part, the values, beliefs, the role of government, ethics, morals, religious practices, etc., do persist from generation to generation, but there are some changes, and we are witnessing some of the changes happening in this current generation, which is really interesting. Another characteristic of culture is that it's an integrated system, meaning that all the parts of a culture tend to be interconnected, right? You touch a culture in one place, everything else is affected. So values can influence things like family size, work ethic, the use of time, and even spiritual pursuits. Changes in technology can influence other cultural values, attitudes, and behaviors, and we are, again, watching this happen. So I'm really looking forward to delving deeper into a lot of the issues that we've talked about in Chapter 2. This is just a preview of them, and I look forward to having interesting conversations with you all in our discussion this week on these issues.